Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. If you've ever taken the time to Google operational excellence consulting, you're probably going to find a pretty sizable mix of the big four consulting firms or a bunch of SaaS and or OEM software providers pitching you a new software platform or a new tool. You may even find a few of these recently popped up AI agencies wanting to work with mid-market manufacturing businesses to help them streamline their operations and solve all of your problems through a shiny new tool. But the challenge is that when you are leading one of these businesses that are kind of often lost in the middle, they've grown to a point where they understand a lot of the mechanics of what is happening. They've seen some success, so they've gotten out of the micro business stage and into the what people would traditionally call the growth stage of business. And they're not quite at that, upper mid-market and starting to, enter enterprise territory in terms of revenue bands or longevity or all of these things. It becomes really difficult because what you're really trying to do is solve a variety of problems. You generally have a relatively limited set of resources. And the other challenge is that typically the folks that are in the organization have been in similar sized organizations, right? And so how do you know what to do, right? Ultimately, it's through a lot of trial and error that you're able to move past the problems that you see, whether it's specific within operations or, supply chain, whether it's, driven by sales and marketing efforts, right? Everybody that's in this, kind of bandwidth. And again, I don't love putting numbers on it because I see similar problems across a variety of different, revenue bands. But, the whole point of why I launched the Crysler Club was because that's the exact environment I grew up in. My parents owned, two different manufacturing businesses that were small businesses, and I saw how hard they worked. I saw how hard they tried to solve the problems that they, kind of faced on any given day. And the vast majority of my professional career was doing similar things. The company I worked for acquired first, second, sometimes third generation family-owned businesses. And, there was a lot of stability in that, right? Obviously, to get from first or second generation, right, you've got to kind of know what you're doing. That said, you also have, set of challenges ahead of you, right? But I grew up in an environment where, ultimately I grew into a P&L responsibility role. But because these businesses were being acquired, we knew we had some challenges, both from hey, how do we pay this initial investment back? And then how do we start to think about growing this business? And because we were operationally focused and we were focused on increasing, ultimately EBITDA and cash, we got really good at becoming really effective and efficient within our own four walls and producing these results. And I had the very fortunate experience or ability to do that multiple times over. And so I share all of this because it's really the genesis of my consulting practice. And how I came to be in kind of a spot to serve these companies that are trying to grow. They're trying to go from A to B. And, you can do that in a variety of ways. You can acquire businesses, you can, kind of grow market share and kind of chase after that. You can be an R&D type of company and, kind of define your own niche or products or services, right? There's a variety of ways to get from A to B. And I haven't met a business owner or operations leader or somebody with P&L responsibility who hasn't had some level of growth on their radar. Now, maybe they're doing it in different ways, but most people have some idea of where they would like to be, right? Maybe they're at 8 million in revenue. They want to go to 18. Maybe they've got their sights set on getting to 80. Maybe they want to grow through acquisition and they know as soon as they can get to 20, 30, 50 million, they can, 10x that because they can acquire, 3 folks kind of that are either adjacent or complementary to their business, and they can get to 100, 200, 300, 500 million, right? So I haven't met somebody who is responsible for a business that doesn't have their sights set on some level of growth, right? So that kind of goes without, that's a given, right? And then again, typically back to some of what I said in terms of, pure resource constraint, pure lens of experience. I've said this a lot, but it kind of goes without saying in this particular episode. We all solve problems through our lens of experience. And you can see this play out not just internally within our own four walls, but how companies kind of go to market, right? Take a SaaS solution, right? Some sort of software solution. Of course, they're going to see their tool as the unlock, as the enabler, as the thing to solve your problem. And, I always use the CRM example because I think most people understand that holistically versus, some of the other, whether we're talking ERP, MIS, or, WMS, like all the other stuff, right? So CRM is really easy to understand because, almost every business has one. But, if you're talking to, let's say, HubSpot, and you're saying, geez, we're really struggling with this adoption issue, and our team isn't using it, and it's not doing this thing right, and it doesn't have access to that thing over there. And you start poking around and talking to folks at Salesforce or Pipedrive or one of the other 10,000 CRM options out there. And of course, they are going to look at that through their lens of experience and say, yeah, that software that you're using today isn't set up to do what you're needing it to do. Of course, we have the ability to do exactly what you need us to do, right? Or whether it's within our own four walls, right? Like, let's go back to my $8 million a year revenue generating company, right? They have a need to hire a new operations leader. Well, chances are that their resource pool is going to be relatively limited and not going to be able to, identify, hire, and onboard a operations leader who has run a Fortune 1000 business, right? Those two resources don't necessarily match. More likely the scenario that they're going to get somebody that has either come up through the ranks, run some smaller organizations that's looking to grow, right? Had some success at a variety of other levels and looking to, continue on that same path, right? So again, it's what lens of experience are people coming at this with? So those are all the kind of things that I tend to, to see when it comes to there being this gap in the market where, most companies that are, let's call them 50 million or maybe even up to 100 million are probably not wanting to work directly with, the big four consultancies because of the horror stories that they've heard about, their models and their business practices and those types of things. And again, that is part of the reason that I launched the Crysler Club, was to help to fill that gap. Somebody that has been in smaller organizations, that has had to be on the ground floor, learn through all of the trial and error and all of the hard lessons. And I've said, many of times, the reason that I bring value into these organizations and even larger organizations is because I've done the work. I am a practitioner. I love the work. I did the work for a really long time. And, I'm going on 30 years of that practitioner level status. So, you cannot replace that, whether it's with AI or any of the other things. There are certain elements of going through, doing the work, learning through trial and error that simply cannot be replaced unless you're willing to invest that kind of time into the experiences that you've moved around, that you've, worked with teams and people of different cultures and different age brackets and different educational backgrounds, different industry experiences, right? All of that is additive in terms of, the skill set. And, am I a unicorn? No, absolutely not. There's a ton of amazing practitioners out there, but that's the lens with which you should be thinking through how to identify somebody that can help you get from A to B. And it often is a little bit more holistic than just saying we have this specific problem, because most problems that exist in these organizations and larger ones are interconnected. It's very, very infrequent that we have a, isolated problem, right? It may seem that way. The data may point to that, but I would say more often than not, it is not an isolated problem. It is, impacted or influenced by a variety of other things. So we need to have an expanded lens of experience to ultimately be able to identify root causes and pick, based on resource pool, what's the most effective way to get us from that A to B, right? And depending on who you talk to, they may have you, they may want to have you be replacing your ERP at, several hundred thousands of dollars. They may, want you to be doing some other unreasonable thing for a variety of reasons, right? I came across an article, this was a couple of weeks ago, but came across an article where someone similar in terms of, consultancy was giving the advice that if folks on your team are not interested in, experimenting and ultimately adopting AI, that you should just fire them right out of the gate. With kind of out any, ramp up or explanation or, coaching, if you will, right? In terms of why are we looking at it, introducing or implementing AI, right? So it's like people say wild stuff, okay? Some of it's for clickbait, but I do wholeheartedly believe that there's a lot of people that believe this stuff. So again, I go back to it's because of their lens of experience. They've never solved problems in a variety of ways. The company I grew up in, capital was most often allocated to new acquisitions. We weren't doing a lot of capital equipment purchases or investing in kind of the newest, the latest, the greatest, XYZ. We were keeping our equipment in tip-top shape. We were repairing that. We were making sure that it was reliable. But that was in an effort because, so I say like our resource pool was constrained and we made do with what we had. And a lot of times that forced really creative thoughts around how we go about solving specific problems, right? The other thing I like to talk about when it comes to, why the Crysler Club and how I put content out is, I think there's a lot of talented doers that are in the continuous improvement, lean manufacturing, systems thinking, theory of constraints, operational excellence, and then it starts to expand out from there, right? All of these different frameworks and methodologies, and I think the big gap there that I see from a practical perspective is that a lot of those folks are too academic. Right. I kind of joke that I'm not that bright, right? I like to keep things simple. And so, I grew up doing the work and learning it through that and not concerning myself with, specific terminology or, the right exact textbook, definition and or execution of something. when I was learning it, for me, it was more important like concept retention and like, practice. Those were the two most kind of critical things that I would look for when we were doing this in a team environment, certainly as I was learning it myself. And, so I think like generally speaking, people get it all twisted. People say things like, oh, don't start with the tools. You got to, get the basics in place and you got to do all of these things. It's like, yeah, I agree with that to a point. But I also see those same people, kind of berate practitioners for not using the, proper Japanese terminology. And, or, my other favorite is, folks thinking that they ultimately need, Six Sigma, because that is, been widely accepted and marketed as the thing. The problem is that most organizations, right, aren't systems mature enough to really be able to utilize all of the tool set within Six Sigma to succeed, in a more in a kind of a more tightly controlled environment. So again, I go back to this general thoughts like, what does operational excellence really mean? For me, it just means like the ability to kind of move from A to B, whatever that means for you, and doing that through a systemization lens, right? So planning, people, process, technology, taking a look at each one of the core functions and, defining those core functions through that lens, and creating a culture of continuous improvement, right? Especially in those kind of SMB into mid-market space where, again, we have a restrained or limited pool of resources. So we don't need an entire, team of academics to, let the rest of the team know that we, mispronounced a specific, tool word, right? Like, I don't care. Okay. My whole thing is like, and I joked around about this before, right? But it's like, go to Gemba, right? You might have heard that. That might be a familiar term, or maybe it's an unfamiliar term, right? But it's, kind of the Japanese term for, go and see, right? Like go to where the work is. It's like, I like to just call that, management by walking around. All right. Again, I'm simple. Right? I don't need to be throwing out all these terms to make people think I'm smart. I'm perfectly content with people thinking I'm not smart, because that's where the real value happens, connecting through conversation and, that context being transferred to, from myself or, through work product to somebody else that can continue to build on these skills, that can continue to practice and actually drive real valuable outcomes for their particular business. So how I ultimately came to be able to do this is through what I consider, a really unique business model. And our unique business model is called Operations on Demand. It's not, traditional fractional consultancy. Traditional kind of fractional consultancy is where, somebody like myself would be truly embedded in the organization and, be responsible for very specific work product, right? Have people that roll up into them from an org chart perspective. And, it's not really project work or retainer based either. Now, understanding it through a retainer lens is probably the easiest way to say it, but I call it a subscription because that to me is what it really is. And, ultimately working with me and the Crysler Club and going with our Operations on Demand subscription model is just that. Either I'm delivering value for you and your organization or I'm not, right? It's pretty simple. So, I don't lock you in with some long-term contract or, some sort of project fee that, is split up. And I've certainly done those things before. It's kind of how I settled into the model that I currently have. But, I feel like it's the best value for the clients that I ultimately work with. and it makes the most sense for me and my business. And it's been working really well. I think our longest term client has been with us now for going on 3 years, and so obviously we've been able to deliver value consistently for them, and they continue to keep me around, right? And I really appreciate it, and I enjoy it. I develop really great relationships with these folks. I really do become an embedded part of the org from an outside perspective. And again, it's because I have a wide lens of experience that I'm able to do that and to speak value from a variety of different places, again, across that organization. Typically, these folks have a very limited number of leadership folks, right? Like across their organization. So, plugging somebody with, like myself, that has a wide lens of experience, is often very valuable inside of these organizations. So, the other thing I would share with everybody is, over time, I've certainly developed some, kind of core frameworks that I call on, because ultimately, over the course of now nearly 30 years, I see similar problems shake out. And those similar problems have helped me to unpack what the actual root cause of many of them are. So that's kind of the genesis of a lot of the frameworks. And I put all this stuff out, in terms of content. But whether it's our clarity, consistency, and accountability framework, or, instead of the typical, PDCA, plan, do, check, act, that you'll find, with lean and continuous improvement, I have our plan, execute, review, revise, repeat framework, right? Because again, plan, do, check, act is simple. It's 4 steps. Mine has 5, right? But the whole point is, for me, I feel like plan, execute, review, revise, repeat makes more sense for most people, right? Plan, do, check, act is kind of like, okay, what exactly am I supposed to be doing in each one of these 4 steps? And if you've done this stuff forever, it makes perfect sense. If this is the first time you're seeing it and you're trying to figure out how to balance, experimenting and like moving the needle and kind of problem solving on the fly versus, paralysis analysis, I don't know, plan, execute, review, revise, repeat just made more sense to me, right? So again, all of this stuff is built on years and years of experience. And, I've owned this fact before, but, making a lot of terrible leadership mistakes when I was a young leader and coming up and trying to figure this stuff out. So, as I mentioned, all of this stuff I put out for free. That's another differentiator, right? Lots of consultants want to gate this stuff and get your email and all of that. The only thing I collect emails for is for our newsletter, because I email it to you, right? But that's it. Outside of that, you can find, I think I'm up to 176 long form blog posts. I don't know how many podcast episodes, but I've got solo episodes with guests, which are a variety of, experts, right? Like practitioners like myself, specific discipline, other business owners, other business leaders, right? Variety of shows there. I don't know how many that's at, but I'm almost positive it's over 100 at this point. So podcast, newsletter. I have another newsletter that I run through LinkedIn. I'm active on social, so I post about all of this stuff that I talk about, on LinkedIn, on X, formerly Twitter, on YouTube, right? So you can find the stuff that I talk about and put out, and actual examples, actual work product, case studies, work history, all of that stuff for free, right? You don't need me. That's literally the best part of what I sell. You don't have to hire me. You could literally DIY all of the stuff I put out into the world. And that's because that's how I learned, right? I literally learned through trial and error over the course of now nearly 30 years. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm putting out all of the best stuff, all the things I learned, trying to share the stories of how those lessons actually led to me being able to now talk about it because of, the mistake I made ultimately. right? So I put all of that stuff out there. And the reason that folks still reach out and, still ultimately hire me is because now we can get into the real specifics. I'm not sharing generalized frameworks and things that, are great to write about or tell stories on a podcast, right? We're diving into the weeds of, specific work product, how we, define a problem and make sure that we're at the root cause level as we start to, talk about corrective and preventative, measures and actions, talking about how we ultimately enable a company to go from 8 to 18 to 80 to 800 million, right? What are the levers that we can pull to do those things? So that's the reason people still, will reach out, and I'll still get an opportunity to work with people. So, I have no worry about putting out as much as I do for free. And in fact, I'm actually in the midst of developing a couple of things right now that my whole entire, kind of hypothesis and intentionality behind it is to do things from a value perspective that other people charge thousands for, because I want to impact more people. And ultimately, I do have a limited bandwidth in terms of how I'm building this business. So I'm not able to, impact the number of people that I would like because of how I'm building my business. And therefore, I want to make more things accessible so people can learn this stuff faster, get more value quicker within their business, and ultimately succeed, right? I think there's no better kind of feeling and driver than seeing people succeed based on your insights and experience. And whether I got to do that and see that benefit from mentor-mentee relationships that I've had over the course of time, or other folks that, I've just taken on and helped, or paying clients, right? There just is no better feeling than to know your experience and your stories and your insights help somebody do whatever it is they're trying to do. So, as a reminder, each one of our solo episodes is a extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. I'd encourage you to go to the website, check that out if you have any interest in subscribing. We do need to get your email. But I promise it's a simple one-click unsubscribe. If you're not getting any value, you get a one version of the newsletter every Saturday morning, sometime around 9:30, because it depends on when I'm done writing it. But I send that out, every Saturday morning. I try to keep it to like 5 minutes or less for you to read and get some value out. Generally, there's at least one nugget, if not two or three. And yeah, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.